Chapter 23. The next morning found them back at the park, though not in the same area. Alex sat in the back of the truck as they drove to the south end this time. Steve had said they were changing locations to keep Rebecca's father from being too comfortable. Alex didn't really get that, but she could understand that changing locations, even just to the opposite end of the large park, was a good idea. Less chance that he had people there first or could plan something. This time, Matt parked the SUV on the side of the street. While everyone was making their way out of the vehicle, she watched as he went to the back and opened the rear gate. "Ever played tennis?" he said to Alex, who still sat in the back, waiting her turn to get out. "A little." She frowned. "In high school." "Why?" "Because." He picked up a pair of rackets and a tube of tennis balls. "It's your disguise today." She didn't bother with a response, as it was finally her turn to climb out the door. Rolling her shoulders, she stretched. It wasn't that they'd been in the car long, but the third row seat was a little tight, and it made her feel like she'd been there longer than she really had been. She took a racket from Matt and the tube of balls, leaving Bobby to take the other racket. It didn't take them long to make their way across the sidewalk and cycle path to the pair of covered tables less than 200 feet from where they'd parked. Alex looked around. There were more than a half-dozen tennis courts right behind the shelter, and a pair of bathrooms a little more than 50 feet away. It was out in the open, but somewhere a lot of people will congregate in a big group. A perfect place to meet. Alex headed to the tennis court right behind the covered tables, thankful it was empty and they could be so close. Bobby was right behind her. "You want to face them or you want me to?" She looked the man she would be playing. "How's your hearing?" He lifted one brow. "Good." She lifted one shoulder, not sure what he was getting at. "If you've got your back to them, will you be able to follow the game and what's being said?" "Yeah." Alex frowned. "But I can't guarantee how well I'll play. Even without splitting my attention, I was never very good." "Good doesn't matter so much. I'm not all that good either, just never had much need to play. But we can pretend to be a couple, learning together." "All right." She turned and looked at where the rest of the group was settling, around one of the pair of tables. Rebecca looked tired, and Alex worried about her. This was hard enough without the extra stress of her father's showing up and being a pain in the ass. After hearing about his behavior yesterday, Alex had been all for refusing to see him again, but her friend wanted to see the rest of her family. Alex couldn't blame her there. She didn't know what it was like to have siblings, much less to feel forced to cut herself off from them. So here she was, waiting for the asshole to show up again. Matt caught her looking in their direction and smiled at her. She smiled back. She was glad they'd talked the night before, and decided to see if whatever was between them was real. Even more so, that he was open to the possibility of moving to Springerville. Her folks would understand if she wanted to leave to be with him, but it would put them in a bind. She didn't want to do that. Her father would overwork himself, probably killing himself even faster. Better get this over with. "I'll serve the first one, let's see how that goes." She turned away from the rest of the group, pulled one of the balls from the tube and set it aside. She moved into position and waited until Bobby was ready, then served the ball. They went back and forth several times before Alex heard Matt's phone ring. He answered, gave directions, then disconnected. "They're on their way. Less than 10 minutes, I'd say, maybe 5. He told the rest of the group behind her. She and Bobby kept playing as if nothing had been said. After all, they weren't supposed to be part of the group. "You catch that?" she asked as she lobbed the ball back at Bobby. "That they're on the way?" He trotted across the court and smacked the ball back toward her. "Yeah." They kept playing in silence until the other group showed up. "Heads up. Bobby said after a while. His eyes flicked to the group sitting at the table, letting her know that the others had arrived. She listened, but as long as they were using conversational tones, she missed about half of what was said. She didn't worry about it. If something happened, Bobby would be able to see it, and if body language didn't tip him off, she'd be able to hear raised voices with no problem. They'd been playing for a little over an hour when Steve sent his mental call to them. "You two can stop now, come over and join us. I don't think we need to hide you anymore. Can I run to the restroom real quick?" She sent back the same way. "No problem," came her clan leader's voice. Handing the tube of balls to Bobby, Alex took her racket with her. She didn't want to make him too weighed down to fight, should he need to. Inside the restroom, she finished her business and washed her hands. She was on her way out, racket dangling from one wrist as she dried her hands when she heard raised voices. She hurried to find out what wrong now. Rebecca's father, Alex knew his name was Neil, from discussions she'd been part of, was standing on the far side of the table where Rebecca sat. He leaned over the table, one finger pointing menacingly in her face. "You could have been something." His words were by no means quiet as Alex rushed forward. "Now you and your spawn are nothing to me. Nothing." He turned and stomped away just as Alex reached Rebecca's side. Nick, Steve, Bobby and Matt were all standing, moving between Rebecca and her father to keep him from touching her, but he never tried. Alex stepped up beside Rebecca, taking Matt's spot as he stepped away to deal with the older man. Taking her place, she double-checked everyone around her, and found that Steve had a firm grip on the back of Nick's jeans, keeping him from attacking his father-in-law. She was glad Steve was stopping him, but she couldn't blame Nick for wanting to rip his head off either. "What now? Are we done here?" Alex asked. She didn't direct the question at any specific person. With the exception of safety concerns, they'd been letting Rebecca make the decisions, so she was waiting for someone to answer. "Well," Steve said after several seconds of tense silence. Alex glanced at him and found he was looking at Rebecca. Looking back to Matt and Rebecca's father, she found them in intense discussion, arms flying in abrupt motions. Matt pointed in their direction and shook his head briefly, but he kept his voice so low she couldn't hear him. "Let's give them a minute, see if they work it out," Rebecca said, looking in their direction. "Either way, Mom, I want you to have my email address." She handed her mother a folded piece of paper. Laurelyn took the paper and quickly tucked it away, almost as if hiding it. Alex glanced back toward Matt and Neil. They were still talking and arms waving, but not as sharply as before. "Mom," Rebecca said, her voice different, "are you and Dad mated?" "Why would you ask that?" Robert looked startled. "I never thought to ask. I don't remember it ever being mentioned growing up." "No, baby. We're not mated." Laurelyn looked sad. "My father arranged the match like yours tried to do for you, but I didn't have the courage it took to defy him and run the way you did." She gave Rebecca a look so filled with hope, it made Alex uncomfortable. Rebecca's mother looked toward her other children, who were still watching their father talking with Matt, then back to her oldest daughter. "Are you really as happy as you look?" "Yes, Mama, I am," Rebecca said with a soft smile. "Nick takes good care of me." She looked up at him and her whole face lit. "And I can't wait for this little one to get here." She put her hands on her belly. "We have a good clan, and they take care of us as much as we take care of them." She looked at JV, who nodded as if confirming the claim. "We all take care of each other. No one fears Nick or Julio, our cadre. That's not the kind of chant we have, and I'm glad." Her eyes flicked to her father where he stood in silence, his arms folded over his chest. Matt wasn't speaking either, but he stood with his thumbs hooked in his front pockets. He looked comfortable, at ease, yet as if waiting for Neil to make a decision. "I don't remember the last time I felt anywhere near this safe growing up." Alex watched Rebecca while also keeping an eye on everyone else. She saw the echo of sadness and fear drift across her face. Laurelyn watched her daughter and Alex thought she caught the look, but didn't think anyone else had seen it, or at least understood it. Alex had seen a bit of fear in her life, she'd felt her share too, but she'd never feared her father. Losing him was what she feared. Movement drew her attention back to the present. Matt and Neil were headed toward them. Neil looked unhappy, but Matt didn't. Matt wore a very carefully neutral face. Alex had seen it before, and knew this was the face he wore when he didn't want to piss anyone off. She wondered what exactly he had said to get Neil to come back. She knew the older man had to have agreed not to say anything else that might upset Rebecca. Matt wouldn't have let him come back if he thought there was a chance that Nick might lose his cool. And he would if the old man kept insulting his mate. Neil sat on the far end of the table where Laurelyn sat, on the opposite side too, as if it was as far as he could get from the rest of the group while still sitting at the table. Rebecca looked at Matt and lifted one brow. He smiled and lifted one shoulder, but that was all. I love you, Mama, and I'd like to keep in touch, but I won't be dragged back there. I will never allow my baby to grow up like I did. Rebecca shuddered. Nick dropped one hand on her shoulder, reassuring her. She covered his hand with hers, and looked up at him with a smile, then dropped her hands to rest on the bulge of her belly. Nick ran one hand back and forth across the top of her back. Rebecca groaned and leaned forward enough for him to be able to rub lower. I'll love you forever if you never stop. Nick straddled the picnic table bench. Spin around. He waited while she turned until her back was to him, then began to rub and massage her back. She curled forward to give him better access. Alex thought it wasn't just the help with sore muscles that her friend was enjoying, but even such simple contact with her mate as well. After a little bit, she turned her head so she could see her mom again. See, he takes good care of me. I don't even have to ask most of the time, and he gives me whatever I want. I never have to think about it, and he makes sure I have everything I need. He protects me. She used one hand to motion to the people surrounding them. And he would never, ever raise a hand to hurt me in any way. She leaned back against her mate, forcing him to stop rubbing her back, but she looked just as content to lean against his chest with his arms around her waist. Holding Rebecca seemed to calm the worst of Nick's temper. In Alex's opinion, that was because how better to keep someone from hurting her than to be holding her himself. She thought it was also possible that some of Rebecca's serene attitude, or at least appearance, might be bleeding through their connection. Robert looked at the two of them, as if something weird had happened. She wasn't sure if it was the way Nick touched his sister, or the way her calm seemed to spread to him. Alex was used to it. She'd seen that happen with her parents. One would be screaming angry while the other was calm, and all they had to do was touch for the calm to spread to the other parent. She thought if it weren't something you'd seen before, it could be a little freaky. Rebecca talked with her sisters a little, asked how school was going, if there were any boys they liked. One turned pink while the other just shook her head. Alex stood and listened while watching the area for anything that could be considered a threat. She wasn't sure how long she'd stood there before Rebecca, shifting again, caught her attention. The Karen grimaced as she moved away from the con and stretched her back. Mama, as much as I hate to say it, I can't take this much longer. Rebecca arched her back then bent from side to side. Sitting here wasn't bad at first, but my back and neck are killing me. She moved forward and hugged her mother. Laurelyn looked panicked and uncertain at first, then wrapped her arms around her daughter. It's been really good to see you and I miss you a ton, but I'm ready to go home, and I don't just mean back to where we're staying in town. She pulled away then moved to hug her sisters as well. I miss my bed, my bathtub and my own things. She smiled to soften her words. And this little one. She rubbed her belly. Has been particularly restless the last couple days. It's as if he or she knows something is going on, and they don't like it. When are you due? Her mother asked, tentatively reaching out to touch Rebecca's belly. The end of August, but I feel like I'm about to pop any day. I don't know how I'm going to handle getting even bigger. I already can't tie my shoes. She stuck out one foot, revealing slip-on shoes. Don't worry about it, kitten. I'll tie them for you. Nick kissed the top of her head. Or I can just carry you everywhere so you don't need shoes. Rebecca rolled her eyes. You probably would too. She sounded annoyed by the idea, but the way she dropped her head against his shoulder belied that. All right, baby, you go home and take care. I feel better now that I've seen you. I know you're happy and healthy. I won't worry so much. Laurelyn patted the back of one of Rebecca's hands, then turned to the rest of her children. Say goodbye to your sister. It may be a while before we see her again. The girls got up, and one by one spoke to Rebecca, then hugged her. Robert looked her up and down, then said a few words before turning away and heading back to their rental car. When the kids were gone, Laurelyn turned back to Rebecca. Your father didn't want to come. He said you'd made your bed, you can lie in it, but I pushed. I'm so glad I did. With that, she turned back toward the car and walked away. Neil stood, gave first Matt, then Steve and JV scowling looks, then turned to Rebecca. You could have been so much more. No, Daddy. I could have bought you more, Rebecca said without flinching. I was nothing more to you than a pawn to buy esteem. If I had stayed, you would have forced me to marry a man more than twice my age, who I could never love. He would have taken care of you. Not the way Nick does. I found my mate, and that's so much more than just a husband. I get that you don't understand, and I'm sorry for that. Even if he were the lowest in the clan, I'd still love him. It's not about status or position. He is my soulmate. He completes me. She looked up at Nick, her eyes filled with emotion. I wish you could understand, even a little bit of what I feel for him and what he feels for me. It's magical. She turned back to face Neil. Please consider letting Rachel and Roxanne at least look for their mates. He started to argue. You don't have to make a decision now. She held up one hand to stop him. There's time. They're both young. Think about it. Please. She didn't wait for an answer before turning to Nick and looking up at him. Take me home. Nick pulled her up against his side with one arm. With pleasure. They left a sputtering Neil watching them go as they made their way back to Matt's SUV, piled in and left. They got back to the condo and JV disappeared into Matt's bedroom, phone to her ear, while she made arrangements for their return. How about a hot shower to help your back then a nap? Nick said to Rebecca as he herded her in the door. I want to get ready in case JV gets a flight tonight. She won't. I told her to book one tomorrow so you can rest tonight. I want to go home. She sounded a bit grumpy. We will go home, but I don't want you to overdo it. They reached the bedroom they shared, and their voices drifted away. Are they always like this? Matt leaned close and asked Steve, his voice barely more than a whisper, but Alex heard it anyway. Lately? Yeah. Steve shook his head. The bigger she gets, the more protective and pushy he is. Alex nodded. It was true. She watched as her clan leader herded his mate into the other room, then went to make sure her things were packed.